Hi, friends. I'm Katie Burns, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the Codex Marcianus graecus 299, and particularly a letter that is in this collection of manuscripts called Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus. Now, I'm putting this together as supplementary material from a course that I'm teaching online, playlist below, on the hieroglyphic monad of John Dee, using a translation Nancy Turner and I made a couple of years ago. But if you have any interest, not just in the monad, but in John Dee and Edward Kelly and angel magic, any kind of angel magic, Solomonic magic, or simply old strange texts, including Greek magical papyri written down as manuscripts, then this is a text you've got to know about. So buckle up here and I will share my screen and we will get started. Okay. What we want to look at is how this connects to John Dee, the Monas Hieroglyphica, and angel magic, Dee and Kelly specifically, but also angel magic generally. We're going to get some of the earliest conceptions of angels connected to alchemy that will connect to the Turbo Philosophorum and also take us back to the stories in the book of Enoch. Now, if you don't know a lot about John Dee or the Book of Enoch, but you just like old crazy manuscripts, great, hang around. What you need to know is the Book of Enoch is biblical apocrypha, and it's heretical biblical apocrypha. It has a connection to, but it is absolutely not the same thing as Enochian magic. That is a magical system based on the scryings of Edward Kelly, written down by John Dee, as they were trying to rediscover the language of the angels that were spoken to Enoch, the biblical patriarch that the Book of Enoch is named about. Okay, by the way, part of this is from a paper that I presented way back in 2010 at the International Medieval Studies Conference, and part of it is tweaked information from an article the late Vincent Bridges and I wrote that was in the Journal of the Western Mystery Tradition about the same time. So these are the questions we're going to explore. First of all, just what is the Codex Marcianus graecus? And we know that it has this letter, Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus, but we'll look at some of the other things there, that they are generally focused on alchemy, and a lot have to do with the connection between alchemy and angels. Yes, that is right. And the ideas, many of them, particularly in the works of Zosimos, who I'll talk a lot about, are very compatible with the strange view of the Book of Enoch. So we want to look at how John Dee gets a copy of this text. It is the oldest alchemical manuscript in Europe, in his time, in our time. Those of you that watched my last video on the Turbo Philosophorum, I said that was the oldest manuscript in Latin. So that's the difference. It's the Turbo Philosophorum was written down in Arabic and then translated into Latin, and it is morphed a little bit to match Abrahamic faiths. And we will see that the angels in this one, which is written down in the 10th or 11th century, but has some copies of texts, some of them which may go back to the 1st century AD and certainly to the 2nd and 3rd, has a very radically different view. So we're going to then talk about how the Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus letter deepens the mystery of nature rejoices in nature, that quote that Dee writes out in Greek in Theorem 15 that has already taken us through the Turbo Philosophorum and through lots of sexual punning in Theorem 15. We also want to see how alchemy gets connected to angel magic, how it connects to Isis, Horus, Osiris, Typhon, and Apophis, to the LBX in Theorem 16, which you recall, that is that light of the cross theorem, which is our only known source of the analysis of the keyword or the LBX formula or signs of the adept used in modern esoterica. And then we can, through all of that, see how these ideas show up later in John Dee and Edward Kelly's angel magic, where angel magic and alchemy are explicitly tied together. And I'll tell you one way right now, if you look at what the angels tell Dee and Kelly that the Great Table of Earth contains, one of the things they say is the secret of all transmutation. All that and more. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at what the Codex Marcianus graecus 299 is. You're seeing one of the sheets from that manuscript now. It's a Byzantine manuscript. It's kept in the Bibliotheca Marciana, or the San Marco or St. Mark Library, and it has many texts beyond the ones we're talking about. It's the oldest known version, for example, in any language, of the Corpus Alchemisticum, which are Greco-Egyptian alchemical texts from the 7th and 8th centuries, written down by Theodorus. This particular manuscript was donated to the Republic of Venice in 1463 by one Cardinal Bessarion. He brought it back from Istanbul, then Constantinople. The fragment we're going to look at, the Isis, the prophetess to her son Horus letter, is at the latest 3rd century Common Era, probably 2nd. The whole codex is a primary source for what we know about Zosimus of Panopolis. Now, if you haven't heard of Zosimos, he's a name that you want to know and explore. If you are doing anything with magic related to John Dee or Edward Kelly, that's the stream of magic that you're in. One could easily make an argument that the mainstream of Kabbalistically based magic like that done in Golden Dawn spinoffs or in AA, or people trying to recreate Greco-Egyptian magic, all of those different types of ceremonial magic draw heavily on Zosimus of Panopolis, whether they realize it or not. This collection is also the oldest source of the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra. That's what the page is you're looking at there. And you see the Ouroboros serpent, among other things. You've seen that in some of my other videos if you've watched them. There are 17 texts that are attributed to Zosimos alone, and there are texts by quite a few other people, including several by Stephanus of Alexandria. The one we're going to look at is anonymous, though. The whole collection, again, is the earliest surviving alchemical manuscript. It's from the 10th and 11th century. John Dee, who was, as you know, an expert in Greek and read the New Testament in Greek, not English, made himself a personal copy, which was also in Greek. The copy was apparently secret enough or special enough to him that he never lists it in his library catalog. We just know that he had it because he apparently carried it back to England with him. Then he apparently took it when he and Edward Kelly went to the continent through Poland and to Bohemia. And then after the Spanish Armada in 1588, when he returned back to England in 1589, he left it with one of his German patrons, where no less a scholar and artist than Goethe read it, but scholars in English didn't know it was there for the most part until Roberts and Watson in their book on Dee's library catalog told us that. So now the Zosimos texts were translated into French, and this is only the beginning of how strange this stuff gets, because what we're going to see is that some esotericists, apparently a number of them, were very interested in the late 1890s and early 20th centuries. And the main scholar that they could rely upon was Berthelot, who was a chemist, linguist, and general genius. And he wrote a collection of ancient alchemists that came out in 1887. You can find it digitized on the web now. And the works of Zosimos are in the part titled The Works of Zosimos. He also published the whole codex and some other Greek texts in Greek. The problem is many people now, unless you're in Greece, don't read Greek. And so you remember in my video on the Turbo Philosophorum how one scholar and esotericist, Arthur Edward Waite, of the Rider-Waite tarot deck fame, I guess, when he was translating the Turbo Philosophorum, he was using the Codex Marcianus to understand the Turbo Philosophorum. But in doing so, he was relying on the work of Berthelot. Well, after Berthelot, there are just very few people outside the world who aren't esotericists who are looking at this until the late 20th century and our own time. However, since I don't have time to talk about all the wonderful strangeness in Zosimos, may I recommend this book by Shannon Grimes. It's part of a series edited by Aaron Cheak. And what Shannon Grimes does here is just this whole book is about these works of Zosimos. Um, Grimes does a fantastic job of taking into account all the recent scholarship this century, which is important, and drawing parallels between things that you might not imagine unless you have immersed yourself in Greek magical papyri has written down in manuscript form and that kind of thing. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the route this manuscript took before I jump into it further. Dee is, of course, from England. In his travels, at one point he winds up where this star is, Venice, the San Marco Library. But this text comes from contemporary Istanbul, was then Constantinople, all the way over here. So the text is gone from here to here, but the writing in it is from Egypt and not Alexandria, like you would think. You think of the Library of Alexandria, and in the 3rd century Common Era, it was the seat of Greek language, literature, arts, and learning. Yes, it's in Egypt, but it was the center of Greek arts and literature at that time, which meant you get this fascinating Greco-Egyptian mix. But go further down the Nile, where that dot is Panopolis. It's called Akhmin today. In the 3rd and 4th century, it was called Chemis because of its reputation for having excellent alchemists there. Panopolis, by the way, is one of the places where they found fragments of the Book of Enoch. It's the legendary home of Perseus in Greek myth. So lots of fascinating things about Panopolis. And of course, it's the home of Zosimus of Panopolis. In the Turba Philosophorum, I mentioned that scholars today think that the original manuscript in Arabic may well have come from Panopolis. If you zoom in a little bit, you can see that to get from Alexandria to Akhmin, which is right near Sohag, Akhmin today is not a big place. There's less than 30,000 people, according to Wikipedia. But it's near Sohag. And if you keep going, you get to Nag Hammadi, Luxor, places you have no doubt heard of. So let's look at the surrounding text before we get to the Isis the Prophetess letter, especially those of Zosimus. So he writes, now he is writing after whoever wrote the Isis the Prophetess fragment. His ideas, scholars agree, are very compatible with the Isis the Prophetess idea, which is why I'm also mentioning him so much here. He refers to daemons a lot, as well as good and bad angels. He will have King Solomon conjuring angels and demons. Now, portraying King Solomon as a magician is just a common portrayal in late antiquity, hence the moniker Solomonic magic. He also is interested, just like the Kabbalists are with Hebrew, he's interested in the Greek alphabet as having mystical properties. A lot of the argument that the ancient Greeks had a Kabbalah connects to some of the writing of Zosimos. When I get to Theorem 23 in the hieroglyphic monad, I may or may not do another video about his work on the letter Omega. He is the only known source of stories about the first real human alchemist. And what I mean by real human alchemist is, if you look at this Ouroboros serpent from the Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra, no one thinks that Cleopatra wrote that. There are other works attributed to her. Or when Dee refers to Democritus, we today talk about pseudo-Democritus because we know that Democritus didn't write those things down. We don't know anything about him. But there are enough references to this real human person named Mary or Maria or Marie that most scholars think that she is a real person, sometimes called Maria the Jewess, sometimes called Maria the Prophetess, sometimes Maria the Alchemist. And the associations that get made with her are difficult to separate from the fact that she's a real person, but it's kind of cool that the first real alchemist was a woman, I think. For more on this fascinating person, you can see Raphael Patai's work, The Jewish Alchemist. It's a fantastic study, more than 500 pages long, of Jewish alchemists. Today, people pick on Patai a bit about the translation he uses, but like I said, everyone who is doing this kind of thing makes errors. His work was groundbreaking. A few more asides about Maria the Jewess, because I just can't help myself here. The real person gets associated with all kinds of people who may or may not be real. For example, in the south of France, she was associated sometimes with Mary Magdalene. Do I think she was Mary Magdalene? I don't even have an opinion on it, to be honest. But I mentioned that one to point out that Mary Magdalene, like Jesus, would have been considered a Jew in the time period here, right? The demarcation between Christianity and Judaism in the second and third centuries, even the fourth century, is not that strong. Sometimes Marie is associated with the wife of Moses. Pretty sure that can't be true. Sometimes she's associated with one of the other Marys in the New Testament, but maybe she was just Mary, a woman who lived in Egypt and did alchemy. We don't know. I also want to remind you along the lines of angels and demons here, where we get our word angel from. It's from the Greek word angelos, which just means messenger. We've been talking about Hermes text, Hermes, Mercury as a messenger. So there is an easy connection between Hermes and Hermetic texts and angels. Now, in Greek, an angel can just mean an attendant spirit or demon. And for some of the texts here, it is that meaning. That is, this is a syncretic or tumultuous, think turba, mixing of a lot of different traditions. Someone who is a purist and wants to know what is strictly Egyptian, what is strictly Greek, what is strictly Jewish, what is strictly Christian, and we're before Islam. Someone like that is going to go nuts with these texts because everything gets mixed together. The current sense we have of angels as heavenly beings associated with the Abrahamic, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim religions comes when you have the New Testament is in Greek. So when the whole Bible gets translated, the Old Testament gets translated from Hebrew, and so the Hebrew word malak gets translated as messenger. Okay, few more things on the Zosimos text before we move on. They show clear knowledge of the Book of Enoch. Now, if you don't know what the Book of Enoch is, just wiki it. I'll give you a kind of thumbnail explanation here, and that is all. It is a kind of alternate Garden of Eden story without the garden. That is, the idea is that there are fallen angels, and they are taken with lust for human women, and they come down from the heavens and they beget this race of giants called the Nephilim. And while doing all of this, they teach these women all kinds of secrets. And then it hooks to the other Garden of Eden story because, of course, this makes men evil. And of course, it's women's fault. Moving on. But make sure you know what that text is. Dee didn't have a copy of it. A lot of wasted time has been spent suggesting that, well, he couldn't know what was in it. Of course he knew what was in it. His whole project of trying to recover the language of Enoch later on with Edward Kelly is informed by knowledge of the Book of Enoch. He knew people like Postel who knew about the Ethiopic Enoch. Later, when he and Kelly are going through Poland, they actually go through a place that had a library where there is a copy of the Book of Enoch in Old Church Slavonic. There are manuscripts of this. The most complete ones are in Ge'ez. Those are the ones found in Ethiopia called the Ethiopic Enoch. Their book 2 is only in the one that's in Old Church Slavonic. There are fragments in Aramaic, Greek, Coptic, Syriac. There's even a small piece in Latin. So moving on here. Once you have refreshed your memory about what's going on in the Book of Enoch, if you need to, or actually all you need to know is the story about angels coming down and begetting a race of giants with women and teaching the women all kinds of secrets. See if this sounds familiar. This is in a work of Zosimos. It's called On 10. And he is writing a letter to Theosebia and says, "The holy writings, madam, say that there is a race of daemons who have intercourse with women and lead them. Hermes also mentions them in his book On Natural Things, and the entire book offers a meaning both manifest and hidden. He mentions it in these terms. The ancient and divine books say that certain angels were taken with a passion for women. They descended to earth and taught them all the works of nature. It's about them, these angels, demons, that our book says that those who became proud were driven from heaven because they had taught to men all things evil, which do not serve the soul. And let me get my face out of the way here. Hold on. There. Okay, so Hermes, a messenger. Angels are messengers. We learned from the turbid the idea that angels are made of the element fire and it's easier to talk to them than God directly. All kinds of interesting beliefs about angels. But this work of Hermes, like the Emerald Tablet, like another work of Hermes we're going to hear about, there's no copy of it around anymore. But this, and does Hermes appear in the book of Enoch? Absolutely not. But Hermes, according to Zosimos, is talking about something that sounds just like the story in the book of Enoch. These angels were driven from heaven because of their pride. Sounds a lot like Lucifer, right? Well, that's one fallen angel, Lucifer, the light bearer. But there's a lot more than one angel in the book of Enoch. This is a translation in the book of Grimes that I talked about previously. So anyway, the angels teach women sorcery. They teach them spells, how to use plants for different medicine, how to conjure with the sun, with the moon, with the planets, how to do basic metalworking, metallurgy, which you might also associate with the alchemy of the mineral kingdom, just like the plant medicine you might associate with alchemy of the plant kingdom. They teach them how to make do jewelry making, to how to grind up stones and put the stones in tinctures, how to make music, what kinds of instruments to use. They associate music with alchemy, and they talk about all kinds of other things we'd associate with physical alchemy, like how to make dye, Tyrian dye is mentioned, cosmetics, how to use particular precious stones, and so on. So, like I said, you can think of the Book of Enoch as the alternate Garden of Eden story. And really, is that any stranger than thinking women were made out of a rib? I don't think so, but I probably would be called a blasphemer by some, and I'll live with it. What I want to point out, though, is that the connection I'm making with the Book of Enoch and with Hermes and with Zosimos when we get to Isis the Prophetess is not just, oh, Terry Burns being a weirdo. It's by now a scholarly consensus. You can go to Google Scholar, type in Zosimus of Panopolis and Enoch, and find a variety of critical articles. I've just put in here an abstract of one. This is Bull saying the alchemist Zosimus of Panopolis, writing around 300 CE, is our only source for a series of treatises by Hermes called the Physica. Oh, different works of Hermes that we have no copy of, which reportedly spoke about angels who had intercourse with women, as in the first book of Enoch, and which credited the revelation of alchemy to an enigmatic figure called Camille, and so on. You can look at that article if you want, but if this information shocks you, I just want to let you know it's kind of a scholarly consensus now that the works of Zosimos are compatible with the books of Enoch, and all of that will be compatible with the Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus letter. So let's look at how John Dee winds up with a copy of this text. Remember, the hieroglyphic monad is written in 1564. So before that time, Dee is doing a lot of book collecting. In 1561, he's collecting Hebrew grammars. The way we know this is because, again, Roberts and Watson wrote all of this stuff down in their book on Dee's library catalog. So the next year, he writes a now lost work called A Compendious Table of Hebrew Kabbalah. How I wish we still had this work around. And he is evidently studying Christian Kabbalah along with collecting things on alchemy, but he's really focused in this time on Hebrew grammars, according to Roberts and Watson. 1563, the year before he writes the Monad. He is in April of that year, he's in Zurich, Switzerland, and he's visiting with the famous Paracelsian scholar and physician Conrad Gessner. Then he heads south. He heads towards Italy to the court of the Duke of Urbino. So the original dukes that built the castle there had died off, so another family had inherited it. But there were reasons, given Dee's interest in sacred geometry, that he would want to be there. There's even, by the way, a fascinating solution that doesn't really work out to the Voynich manuscript about the castles in it being associated with the Dukes of Urbino. Anyway, another whole topic. But they were considered a masterpiece of proportion, and the way that they played with light was greatly noted. But the person who was there when Dee visited was the Commander General of the Papal States. He was the leader of the ongoing wars against the Ottoman Turks. So basically, he needed better weapons. And someone like Dee, skilled in optics and mathematics, would be someone you might invite to visit you. So one can conjecture, and it's only that he was using the palace of the Dukes of Urbino as a base as he made trips to other places in Italy collecting books. We know that he went to these places because he put the year and the place he got them in the books, which is how Robertson Watson figured where he was book collecting. So he made buying forays to Padua, he made them to Milan. Most importantly, though, he went to Venice. The Library of San Marcos that we've talked about, Dee had actually wanted to visit since 1556. He writes about this in his supplication to Queen Mary. In this letter, where he is saying that England should have its own library, he says, and he wants to go look at the library in San Marcos. So it has to be there in 1563 that he reads and copies in Greek the Codex. And the year after that, he writes the Monas Hieroglyphica. It is not a radical conjecture at all, then, to speculate that Dee, as an expert in ancient Greek, the expert on ancient Greek geometric treatises like that of Euclid and Apollonius, a skilled Neoplatonist aware of works like the Timaeus, that Pythagorean cosmogenesis we've talked about, that he then imports into that Christian Kabbalah, which is already using Pythagorean ideas, and now he is importing some of the ideas that he finds in the Codex. So we're finally ready to look at the Isis the Prophetess to her son Horus letter, which is in the Codex. So let's do that. First of all, just to remind you, this is not from I should just get rid of that thing, shouldn't I? This isn't by Zosimos. It predates Zosimos. It was obviously not written down by Isis either. She's a goddess and her son is a god. So we don't know who wrote it. Grimes and others that, like Mertens, suggest that Zosimos had to be aware of it. Zosimos is coming after. Zosimos's ideas are compatible. And he espouses similar ideas. He uses similar words in Greek in the same order. So I've already mentioned that Zosimos knows the Book of Enoch. He knows the stories of angels mating with or raping human women and begetting a race of giants, the Nephilim. Now, this anonymous letter is going to have a similar story about a goddess. So that's interesting. The structure of this letter shows up in other letters that are magical texts. For literary analysis, the best one I know is Fabiana Lopez de Silveira's work, which is her Oxford dissertation. I put a link to it below. She goes through also different translations. She goes through the recent scholarship, and she dates the text as just after the Pseudo-Democritus texts, which are in the 1st century, which in Theorem 15, it seems like, since Dee mentions Ostanes, and Ostanes is in the Pseudo-Democritus text, that could be what he's referring to. And anyway, she says it's just after those texts and before the text of Zosimos. And she also reviews the extant scholarship of Mertens. I put some references to that below. You can also find Mertens scholarship online. If you can, hope you can read French. It's very convenient that de Silveira has gone through all of them for us if we don't speak French. Now let's talk about the letter. Isis starts by telling her son Horus about something that happened while he was on the verge of contending with Typhon. Now, it's easy to let that part of it pass unless you think, when would Horus have been contending with Typhon? That sounds like Set. So most obviously, Typhon would be the brother of Isis, Set, who killed and dismembered her other brother, Osiris, who is also her husband, who you see a picture of here. So in the usual story, Set dismembers Osiris, and then Isis puts all the pieces back together, resurrects these pieces, and he's reborn as her son, Horus. Now, if you can see this idea of taking apart something and then putting together a better version of it as the Alchemical project, you can see perhaps why this winds up in a collection, an alchemical collection. There are other syncretic connections in the magical papyri between Typhon, who is a Greek serpentine monster who tries to overthrow Zeus. Would be Jupiter in the Roman pantheon, but it's Greek, so this is Zeus. Remember, in the monad, we were looking at golden and silver ages, and the silver age starts when Zeus overthrows Kronos. So there are connections there. There's connections with Apophis or Apep, who is another giant serpent associated with disorder in the Egyptian pantheon and the opponent of Mot or light or truth. And of course, the other easy association is Yahweh, because the origins of Yahweh was as this desert god of disorder. Now, of course, that's not how Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh is used in Kabbalah, rabbinic, Christian, Hermetic, or otherwise. But it is an association you can easily make in this time period. Also, in many works of Zosimos, we see giant serpents, at times sacrificed, broken up into parts, then resurrected. In fact, in the book by Grimes that I've already referred to a couple times, Grimes draws an explicit parallel between this letter from Isis to Horus and some things going on in works of Zosimos, where a serpent is sacrificed, the sacrifice of the Ouroboros serpent or the Apophis serpent. Grimes says evokes themes of death and salvation, but at the same time, it's supposed to show Zosimos researching nature. There's that nature again. You also see Ouroboros sometimes with a slogan like "the one is all," reminds us of the monad perhaps, and associated with Mercury, just like Hermes is, and philosophic Mercury that you use to make the philosophical stone. But we are wanting to see what Isis told Horus, so I will keep going here. Okay, she's said that this, basically, Horus, I want to tell you something that happened while you were on the verge of contending with Typhon, and we've realized, hey, if Horus is doing something contending with Typhon, this sounds like it's not exactly Horus, but it's Osiris, who is about to get killed by his brother, cut into pieces, and Isis is going to put them back together. So this may be the process of Horus being born. Then we're told her son is at Hermeneuthis. This is a place of the sacred art of alchemy, but no record of such a place exists. So where could it be? Well, Lopez de Silveira, in that wonderful thesis I just mentioned, she says that Gus goes through all the ink that has been spilled on this, people trying to figure out where it is. I once followed the work of Vincent Bridges and Jay Widener. In fact, I helped edit the book they wrote together, and so I agreed with their thought that it meant Hermopolis. A lot more scholarship has come out since then, so I have changed my mind, because at a certain point I was going over this and thought, well, yeah, Hermeneuthis, what does that sound like? Sounds like Hermanubis, doesn't it? Hermanubis is a god synthesized from Hermes and Anubis. Hermes we know is a messenger. Anubis conducts souls in the underworld. The underworld has all sorts of associations with alchemy, because the alchemy of the animal kingdom, remember, is creating or extending life. The underworld is where you go for rebirth by this line of thinking. So where are we? We're in the underworld, where Osiris is about to be, he's been sacrificed, and he is about to be reborn as Horus. So you're eavesdropping on the gods after a really significant mythological event, and you're at the place where Isis is in the underworld, perhaps, after Set has killed her husband, but before she's reincarnated him as her son. All right, so Isis continues and says, it came to pass that one of the angels that resided in the firmament have watched me from above, desired to get together with me. Get together with me for what? Not tea, we suspect. He made the first move, and I was going to proceed to this business, but I would not yield, wishing to learn the preparation of gold and silver. So she wants to know the secret of alchemy, it seems, or whatever gold and silver mean here. And after I asked him this, he said that he did not want to talk about this himself, given the greatness of the mysteries, and that on the next day, the angel Amnael, mightier than him, would come, and that he would be up to providing an explanation about the investigation of these things. He told me about the sign he had on his head, and that he would display an unpitched vessel full of translucent water. He wanted to speak the truth. Notice Amnael. This has a Semitic ending. It sounds like a Hebraic angel in this story of Egyptian mythology. Of course, historically, I mean, Moses escapes from Egypt, right? I mean, so it's not a surprise unless you somehow are used to not associating them. This angel name doesn't appear anywhere else. There are all kinds of reasons I would say it would have fascinated Dee, but let's get to those later and look at this sign that he has on his head, and he would display an unpitched vessel full of translucent water. What does that mean? Is this water the element? Is this like, oh, the water after God parts the waters? Is it H2O? And what is this unpitched vessel? Also, he, in this quote, there is some discussion about what the gender of this angel is, if it has a gender, if it's male, female, both, neither. The language in Greek that the angel uses for desire, according to scholars who have written about it, matches the technical language in other papyri. You can explore that more on your own if you want. It particularly matches the way the four elements mixing together is described, even in the Timaeus, by the way. Now, Vincent Bridges thought that this sign might have meant that that Amnael was related to Khonsu of Thebes. Others have associated it with different things, and the whole pairing of Amnael, Isis, and Horus has an unmistakable Christian parallel of the angel Gabriel talking to Mary before the birth of Jesus. So because of these things, I'm convinced this is supposed to be in the underworld, and Isis is, I think, learning the secret of how to put Horus back together. Now, it never says that, so you can have your own interpretation if you want. There is, by the way, a very famous silk from Panopolis dating back to this time period, and it's called the Gabriel silk because it has the Annunciation story on it. It's also very common in this time. It's extremely common to see depictions of Jesus and Mary looking like Isis and baby Horus. There's some nearby where I live here in the Midwestern United States. If you go to the Field Museum in Chicago, in the Egypt collection, there's, I mean, it's a common portrayal. So the idea that we have Isis talking to her son Horus maybe syncretically evokes the idea of Mary talking to Jesus. Anyway, like the very first angel in this story, the one from the first firmament, which would be above the prima mobile, it's above the fixed stars, Amnael is filled with desire for Isis, and Isis keeps resisting Amnael. Not because she seems offended exactly, except that she is working on her intellectual pursuit. And her intellectual pursuits are alchemical. So about this time, perhaps she learns how to make Horus. Anyway, Amnael keeps coming on. She keeps resisting. Actually, before she can make Horus, she has to learn the sign of alchemy to put him back together, doesn't she? So finally, Amnael shows Isis the sign on his head, whatever that is, and then he transmits to her the secret of alchemy she desires. So then she submits to him and learns the secret of alchemy. So I would argue the secret she learns is what allows her to create her son Horus. You can also read this, you can read this sexually, most people do. You can read it as some kind of energetic merging. You can read it as temporary spirit possession. Something happens. And then Amnael adjures Isis. Adjures is like command, or to bind someone, or to force them to swear an oath. She or he or it adjures Isis, in the name of the sky, the earth, light, and darkness. I adjure you in the name of fire, water, air, and earth. I adjure you in the name of the height of the sky and the earth, and of Tartarus's death. I adjure you in the name of Hermes and Anubis, of the bark of Cerberus, of the serpent guarding the temple. I adjure you in the name of the ferry boat and the sailor through Acheron. I adjure you in the name of the three necessities and their whip and sword. And then Isis says, having adjured me with these, now wait a minute, adjured is what we call grammatically a transitive verb. You adjure someone to do something, or you bind them to something, you command them to do something, you make them swear an oath about something. But we don't know what she has been adjured about. She just says, having adjured this with me, he commanded me not to transmit this to anyone except my dear and legitimate child, so that he be you and you him. So Amnael has part of the substance of Horus, because through this energetic merging, it's been transmitted through Isis to Horus, who I would say can now be born, though the letter doesn't exactly say that. So what most people puzzle over is, what did the angel abjure Amnael, that should be Isis, pardon me, not to do? That's Isis again, not Amnael. Amnael is the angel. Nothing. It is never said what this adjuration is about. It is a really strange construction that all the commentators notice. Now, I'm not saying I noticed that. My knowledge of Greek is just a little bit beyond the alphabet. But what commentators say about it is that the Greek words themselves are part of a very strange construction, and the words themselves seem to contain the ritual of whatever this thing is that is unsaid. Adjure, as I mentioned, is just, it's a command. It means to adjure is to bind, to charge something, as if you're going to get cursed if you don't do it. Let me read you another translation. This is from Vincent Bridges. He said, I charge you in the name of fire, of water, of air, and of the earth. I charge you in the name of the heights of heavens and the depths of the earth's underworld. I charge you in the name of Hermes and Anubis, the howling of Kerberos and the guardian dragon. I charge you in the name of the boat and its ferryman, Acherontos. And I charge you in the name of the three necessities and the whip and the sword. So, similar idea. Isis is passing the mystery on to her son after this, but it's an energetic mystery. There aren't words used to describe whatever the mystery is, and it's created by this sexual encounter with the angel Amnael. Isis is further charged and bound by Amnael's words. So then how does she pass the secret on to her son? Well, the same way it was passed on to her. Does this mean she has sex with her son? Well, or she energetically merges with him? Use your imagination, but the ideas of what the gods do frequently include things like, oh, marrying your brother, your sister, and your son? Not usually. Then Isis tells him to find the farmer Akaros. Now, is the farmer Akaros here connected to this ferryman? Some argue that, but that name, like Amnael, doesn't appear anywhere else, okay? It could be the mythical boatman of the underworld, Acheron, but it could be a lot of other things that to me are even more fascinating. It could be a play on Akiros or Akaros, that is, within Hinduism, either a teacher of something religious or a set of things that you need to maintain day-to-day life. We're not any farther away from the Indian subcontinent than we are from England when we are talking about Panopolis. Anyhow, Isis continues. Isis lectures Horus. She says Horus must realize that this is the whole creation and the whole process of coming into being. Horus is being born. That's what this sounds like to me. And know that a man is only able to produce a man, and a lion, and a dog, a dog. And if something happens contrary to nature, then it's a miracle and cannot continue to exist, because nature rejoices in nature, and only nature overcomes nature. Here we have, then it is a miracle. Other times it's a monster. That's an interesting difference. But This is the same section that we saw in the turba that A.E. Waite was reaching over to this letter to try to use it to explain nature rejoices in nature in the turba. And we remember nature rejoices in nature in D writing that out in a mainly Latin text in Theorem 15. He writes, nature rejoices in nature in Greek. So the obvious or most common place you'd see that would be in the Turba Philosophorum. He writes it out in Greek, so okay, maybe it's not the Turba, maybe it's the Pseudo-Democritus texts that are the 1st century, because he then says has the great Ostanes concealed in his greatest mysteries. Ostanes we don't know any of the work of. This is reputedly a Persian magus who learned the secrets at Memphis and then taught him to Democritus, according to the Pseudo-Democritus. But like, we don't know. It seems, and that whole story gets told in here in the dialogue with Cleopatra, which is something else in the Codex Marcianus. So that could well be where D gets the great Ostanes. Nature rejoices in nature is a quote you get many, many places. But the idea of what is meant by that you get most succinctly put in this letter and not really anywhere else. And what we are learning here is what nature means is how to recreate, how to create and resurrect life. That's pretty amazing. If you understand nature, you can create and resurrect life. If you want to take it literally, you can take it and most people will as a metaphor for a kind of spiritual alchemy. Anyway, Isis continues here and says, for as I said before, grain begets grain, a person sows a person, and thus one who sows gold reaps gold, and the similar it's similar, and now the secret is revealed. Then you're ready for this, right? Okay, tell me the secret. But she shifts into these technical alchemical recipes, some of which you can actually do. So you wonder, what was the secret? I mean, a reader finishes and thinks, well, gee, did I miss something here? I thought, no. What was it? It's just kind of flat. So that's the end of the letter. Now, let's talk about how the Isis, the prophetess, to her son Horus letter deepens the mystery of what D means by nature rejoices in nature. Well, suddenly this famous line from that's also in the later and much better known Turba Philosophorum connects not only to alchemy but angels, but what seems like a sexual revelation. If you want to import ideas from Tantra, you could do that. Or maybe you could say, gee, are the ideas already there and they are being written in? Or are we looking at something else that is much more common in Eastern religions than Western, which is the idea, first of all, of the body itself as a microcosm of the macrocosm. We get that too in Kabbalah and in a work like Plato's Timaeus. But the idea of energetically merging with a spiritual being is much more Eastern than Western, one might say. So if you look at this as a physical or energetic merger or both, then you're looking at this profound psychosexual energetic experience going on in the underworld. By the way, one of the things that many writers, Dion Fortune is one of them, have said about the process of initiation is that it's supposed to be like going through the underworld or going through the after death experience and coming back while you're still alive. In effect, in this letter, Isis has brought the concept of alchemical transformation back from the underworld. And I would say what she has learned is how to resurrect her son. She's taught it without words to her son, who is the reincarnation tantrically of her husband. And it's by learning it, this may well be how she's resurrected him. I told you this text was going to be good. So when you read this text, you have an idea of, oh, this is what was meant by nature begets nature. This is how to create or extend life, much more than change lead into gold. And it explains in ways, or at least makes more exciting, all the repetitions in other places of nature begets nature. Nature rejoices in nature. Nature overcomes nature. Nature does this to nature, whatever. And then at the end of some of them, you are then reminded that one is all. So if that's the case, then on a certain level, there's not a difference between this lion and grain and so on. That's another whole discussion, but it's kind of a fascinating one. We might see why A.E. Waite, who probably knew all these things, tries to explain parts of the Turba Philosophorum he doesn't understand by grabbing on to things from the Codex Marcianus, especially this letter. Also, now to go back to John Dee, think of all the times he invokes the concept of Horus Gamos. Now, Dee's not unique in this. There's a whole literary concept very common in the Renaissance of male writers talking about wanting to be the bride of Christ, which means they want to be filled with the energy of Christ. And in Dee's Light of the Cross theorem, and in some places earlier, we see that he has merged his Christian Kabbalah with his other ideas, the ideas that you're anointing yourself, becoming the Christos, and moving up to Tiferet, associated with the sacrifice god, Yod-He Shin Vav-He, or Jesus. But Osiris is another sacrificed god, right? And resurrected, like Jesus, to become Horus. So is the sacrificed god Osiris, Horus, both. Anyway, there's also the discussion he gives you about some concepts within the Catholic Church then of hypostatic union, which is how Jesus can be perfectly divine and perfectly man, and consubstantiality, which is the idea of how the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost share the same substance, that are being taught to a reader because the idea is the reader shares that substance and is also divine. Theorem 18 puns relentlessly on being generative, even in grammar. It talks about the house of conjugal love. Vincent Bridges once called that theorem the tantric key to the whole monas, and I would tend to agree. All right, now that's theorem 15. We're going to go to theorem 16 now and talk about how this connects Isis, Horus, Osiris, and Typhon Apophis to the LVX of theorem 16. This is something that when we are past theorem 20 in my monad course, I'll have another whole video on, just for those of you who are familiar with LVX as the analysis of the keyword or the signs of the adept and so on. Because, as I've mentioned, that LVX formula has its only known source, theorem 16 of the monads. But if you know in your practice something like this that you are doing, you know how these terms appear there, and they seem kind of odd. That is, some adepts, or self-proclaimed adepts anyway, have claimed that this formula is wrong because it shouldn't include Typhon and Apophis. Well, if you read this letter in context with the works of Zosimos, it's not wrong. What it is where did they get these ideas from? What you start to realize is theorem 15 in its allusion to the Codex, and nature rejoices in nature. If you take the meaning in the Isis, the prophetess, to her son Horus, you get the rest of this formula from the monad as well. That is, as I said at the beginning of this, whoever is putting these things together in the late 1800s, late 1800s, early 19th century, and then on, knows more about these works than the scholars of that time do. And it's not until now that scholars are catching up with those esotericists like Waite writing in 1894. But paradoxically, as scholars have caught up, a lot of modern day esotericists don't really seem to know, in my humble opinion. So the rest of this formula, the morning of Isis, for example, would directly tie to this letter. So I would just suggest that whoever put the signs together and the signs of the adept and who wrote the words out understood the hieroglyphic monad very well and understood Dee's nod to this text, the letter Isis the prophetess to her son Horus. Waite's annotation of the turba suggests that's why he was pouring through Berthelo and trying to explain the turba with part of the codex. It's probably later why Aleister Crowley was interested in the use that Carl Jung's student Marie von Franz made of it. So there's a whole fascinating hidden history here that maybe someone will find out. And I just want to suggest, because I know it is there, I just can't quite locate it. Some conclusions that we can draw, though. The Codex Marcianus is the smoking gun, so to speak, that shows how Dee and later Dee and Kelly connected alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone to angel magic. Within this smoking gun, the real smoking gun, is the Isis the prophetess to her son Horus letter, which suggests that talking to and merging with angels will reveal the secret of the Philosopher's Stone. The secret seems sexual in nature. At least it has to do with energetic merging. It shows again also that Dee had no inhibitions with mixing traditions. In fact, he loved to synthesize from different traditions. But the tradition that he will privilege comes from Greco-Egyptian, Hebraic, this kind of mix associated with Panopolis or Achaemenid and Alexandria. Why? Because it's older. And fortunately for him, as an expert in Greek, he not only can read it, he's an expert in Greek texts, and he can place things in context far better than anyone else in England of his time. The ideas in the Isis the prophetess fragment connect directly to theorems 15 and 16 in the hieroglyphic monad and the concept of angel magic, which Dee will pursue for the rest of his life. Now, the fact that some later people understood this is evident in some initiatory societies' use or probable use of the material, especially one of the origins of the belief that true alchemy comes from fallen angels and the implicit connection in the book of Enoch. Last of all, for those of you who study Enochian magic and know about Dee and Kelly's infamous spouse-swapping adventure in Trebona, you might also find your background of how Dee could be persuaded to do that, because he seems very unhappy about it. He goes back and talks to the angels a second time. Like, are you sure you mean sharing union carnally? Yes, that, among other things. Well, if you have read this, and we know he have, and he copied it down and kept it with him and had it with him in Trebona when this was going on, if things weren't going well with their angelic revelations, maybe they needed to swap spouses, or at least you can maybe have a more sympathetic idea of how he could be persuaded of that rather than just being kind of a dupe of Edward Kelly's sex drive. So some other things you can explore here if you want. You can look at the gematria of Amnael. That's fascinating. You can look at the names of some of the other angels that Dee shows interest in. So Amnael is the only place you find Amnael, but you find an Anael all over the place who's associated with Venus. Dee thinks he's living in the age of Venus. You find Dee writes out the name Anael with two N's in all caps as the first angelic name that he writes in his spirit diary. And perhaps even Ananael, who is the fourth watcher in the book of Enoch. If you're familiar with the LBX formula, I would suggest you try to connect it to some of the things we've talked about here and in theorems 15 and 16. For instance, how in the synthesis of the different traditions Dee is using, would you synthesize this with Dee's Christian Kabbalah? When you're doing the INRI Yod Nun Resh Yod thing at the beginning there, well, what is the alchemical meaning of that? We know it's the letters above Jesus on the cross, but there's an alchemical meaning of it also. Then what kind of light is descending upon the initiate? This light of the cross is not a biblical thing, but the light of the cross is the crux of the matter, crux being Latin for cross also. But the light of the cross is what theorem 16 is all about. What kind of light is descending upon the initiate? The light of Tiferet, as you know. So I'll return to all of that after I finish this, my next video, which is on theorem 20. But you have all the tools for this you need now. To talk more about it, I think, would be to go on when some people just may have a scholarly interest. All of these sources and more I've dropped in below. So I hope that you have learned a little about this fascinating letter. It is one of my favorite old texts, and not only because it's just so strange. Okay, have a great day, and I'll see you with another video in a week or so. Bye for now.